It's flashing. That's a good sign. Back to Greek. Oh, I can't handle Greek. I don't know about that other stuff. I'm sorry we couldn't get the final door glass. That was my fault, but whatever. Welcome. Let's see. I see mostly clear. Mostly people I know, so everybody I know. But anyway, maybe we'll pick up some new ones. The problem is in this introduction, this is not, well, I don't know. This is like missing the first class in college. So if you miss first class in college, you miss all the really, like when are the tests and, what are you going to do? What's the point of the class? What's the foot stompers? Whatever. I gave you a list, and I know I've got a whole bunch of Greek words. We'll look at a little bit. We're not going to necessarily, we'll eventually see all of these Greek words. These are very critical and important words specifically for what we'll discuss. But if you notice, I gave you a course outline, and I apologize already. If you look at the course outline, you'll see that for me to fit it onto the page, I had to do a little trickery. So, for example, all the major headings, and these are at least, I'll tell you exactly how I want to approach this, but if you look to C, you'll see it goes 6, A, B, C, and then D is on the same line. Because otherwise I couldn't have fit it on one line. But if you interpret it properly, you'll get it. So for example, there's a few others that are the same way, where they, the subheadings have been subsumed under the previous one so that I could fit it on the page and so you can get the whole thing. I thought about breaking it up, but that would be horrific. So the plan in this class, and I'll go more over the details of the class, but I was going to handle it pretty much like I did Hebrews last time. And the point is, if you decide that you don't like doing it that way, we can do it in a little higher fashion or higher level fashion. But I intended to go over eventually go over each verse in the Greek, pointing out the meanings of the words and the word heritage meanings. In other words, what they mean actually in the Greek. You know what I'm saying? Well, we'll see. Okay, if you don't know what I'm saying, I'll get right down to the specifics of what that means. But the point is to understand the Greek culturally, and that's a big deal. Okay, in this class, that's the point of this class. I put here culture and literature, but the whole class is about culture, history, and language. So it's not, we'll talk about what that means in terms of doctrine and theology. I really don't care much about, I do care about doctrine and theology. I do care. But the point of the class is to present the culture, the history, and the language without bringing in any baggage from, for example, doctrine and theology. Now, if we talk about historical doctrine and theology, that's history, right? So if you ask, and by the way, that I may be going piecemeal instead of in a logical fashion, but if you have any questions at all, ask the question. Even if you don't think it applies, or if it's doctrine, theology, I don't care. What we'll do is if we say, hey, that's an obvious culture or history or language question, hey, that's cool, right? If it's historical theology or historical doctrine, for example, the class always get this question, or always we get the question about the mikvah, the baptism. And we're going to talk about the baptism of John, right? The baptism, because that's a pre-essay kind of thing in John is a critical issue. So we will talk about the mikvah. And so when you talk about the mikvah, you say, well, why don't we do baptism like the mikvah? That's a perfectly reasonable question, and that's theology and doctrine, but it's historical. So you answer the historical question, well, is this how they did it? Is this how we think that the early Christians did it? Here's what we do. And here's what other people do. Oh, you mean other churches do different things? That's interesting in itself, right? I mean, Orthodox are cool. They do it in the nude, even for adults, and they cover you over pretty quickly. But you know, that was classically what they did in the New Testament era. And by the way, what the mikvah is all about, the Jewish bathing. But anyway, the point of this is, like I said, we'll look at culture, history, and language. And I gave you the introduction. So the first parts of this, and I guarantee you we'll get in very quickly, but we have to do certain things. The first thing we have to do is you have to know the basis. I guess you should close it. Something's loud. I don't know what they're playing. Okay, whenever we are going to talk about a document that is Greek, it's ancient Greek, and I do try to dabble. I try to understand ancient Greek. I try to process it, and I try to explain it in a way that's understandable to others. And that's the whole point, right, of learning in the first place. But we are going to take a document that was written about 2,000 years ago and try to understand it within the context of our understanding. So to do that, you just can't, in my opinion, they do this all the time, and it really irritates me. If you've had a college class in history, what I think they should be doing the first thing is introducing the culture, the history, and the language of the documents they're going to use. And then they need to prove the veracity of the documents. What do I mean by that? The veracity of the documents are the accuracy of the documents. How accurate are they? Can we trust them as history, for example? Now, I'll give you a precursor. You know this class anyway. Yes, John is a great, verifiable historical source, but we will prove it. Now, how about Josephus? I'll throw that out. We will see that Josephus is not a very good historical source. But guess what? If you go to Fringe University, or Newman University, or Concordia, or to especially secular universities, Concordia will probably give you, well, I'm not sure how they teach their classes. I'm not sure if they use, evidentiary-based methods as much. I'd like to know. I'd like to talk to the pastors about it, because I don't know how they teach their classes specifically. But usually in the classically, and we'll talk about this, classically in theology schools, they see no need to teach veracity. You know why, right?
They take it for what it is. I mean, you know, they already
Well,
feel like it's...
in general, and this comes back to, I'm sorry, I'm going to throw out the term Tübingen School. What happened at Tübingen School is, and this is very important historical kind of information, and yes, we're doing rabbit tracks, but that's okay, a little rabbit track's all right, especially as we explain or understand why we are where we are today. Tübingen School was started by the Lutherans, and I'm sorry they did this. We did this to ourselves. But in Tübingen School started about the 1800s, and the problem was archaeology was in the essence science. They had just started archaeology. And when they started archaeology, guess what they said? Guess what they couldn't find? Proof. A lot of historical proof for stuff that they really were excited about looking for, like Babylon. Couldn't find Babylon. They couldn't find some of the evidences in Jerusalem. They couldn't find evidences of some of the, like Pontius Pilate. They couldn't immediately find it. It was nascent. It was brand new. They were just developing methods. And so Tübingen School said, it's not important to prove the veracity. What's important is the faith. Does anybody see a problem with that? If, for example, I'm Hindu, I could bring you my Bhagavad Gita, and I could show you a Hindu or Mormon Bible, for example, or other Bibles, other holy documents, and I put it in front of you, and I say, what makes this true? Does my faith make it true? No, your faith is nothing. It's immaterial. What you believe is immaterial. What matters is it true, right? And if you remember, we looked at the Torah the same way. If you take the Torah, and we have more problems with the Torah, but I think we can stand on a very strong foundation of veracity for the Torah. The strength of the foundation for the New Testament documents is 1,000, 1,000,000 times better. So my point is this: if I were to put out the Bhagavad Gita and you'd say, ask a Hindu person, why do you believe that? And they would say, because of faith. But if I hand you the book of John, the Gospel of John, what should be your answer? It's not my faith.
Because that's true. It happened.
Because it's true. Yeah, it's history. It's an accurate historical document. I'm a scientist. My basis, the whole life is science and engineering. And I would not be a Christian today, in heart, mind, or soul, if I could not prove, if there were no proof to it. Right? And that's basically what we're going to talk about. And okay, here's a tap in the theological pool. What's the purpose of the class? If I can give you the tools to understand, number one, that's self-understanding, self-fulfillment. So I want to understand, you want to understand, right? You want to know what the words say in the Greek. You want to know the culture and the history and the language. Because the next stage is, now how do I apply that? The application part, that's your homework. Do whatever you want to do. But the big deal is, if you can prove it to yourself, if I can prove it to you, then you can prove it to anyone. And the thing is that you take that information and your I don't like to use the word faith. Your understanding is firmer. Your ability to commit your children, your grandchildren, other people are now in a fixed way. Because I assure you, I've studied this enough to be able to say with confidence, this is all correct. So anyway, the whole point is, we'll look at the ancient cultures, we'll look at veracity, we'll look at the literature, we'll review, there's a thing called Logos and Telos, which we'll get into, and you guys know about that, the rabbinic understanding, and then we'll look at this at 6, and I guarantee we'll try to do it before 6, but with 6 we start looking at the actual document in detail. And so I've broken it, these are the, this is what most scholars call the basic outline. Now, what does that mean? Okay, depending on what Bible you pick up and who you pick up or your source, you'll find outlines, scripture outlines for all kinds of things. You know what I'm talking about? There are outlines that are basically outlines of what the text is about. Then there are spiritual outlines or theological or doctrinal outlines. This is what we would consider a historical outline based in the text. So if you notice, there's 3 basic parts. There's the history, the prologue. There's the historical prelude called the Book of Signs, and then there's the historical veracity called the Book of Glory. And I added those other portions because we will, it will become very clear how these fit within the context of this information. And if you remember back to Hebrews, for example, when we talked about, in Hebrews, we were talking a lot about the culture and the history of the time. Likewise with John, that's what we'll do. So anyway, and then the other set. So that's the basic information. You keep that at hand. I'll probably refer to it in general. But the point is, number one, we're going to, next week specifically, I may continue this a little bit, but we will precisely define the veracity of John. And I'll give you a piece of paper so you can use it for data, and I may bring, sometimes I bring slides for that, so we can look at it, because I know we looked at it before for Torah, but that was, 2 years ago? And then, so every class I've got to remind you, because these are, these are the fundamentals of the whole point of, we are historians on the way to evaluate a historical book. And by the way, okay, here, I'm going to throw this out. Do historians read history books?
No.
No. Historians don't read history books. They write them and sell them to you. Historians read the original documents. So we are going to do just like historians do with the book of John. And here's the freebie. I always do this. It's not just the book of John. We're going to look at extra biblical sources that support it historically. We're going to look at, and I try not to mix and match too much. What does that mean? You can't. We will see when we look at veracity how you legally, how you can properly and correctly look at stuff. For example, let me see if I can get a good example. Is Isaiah a good proof text for the Gospel of John? Not really. Why? Because it's not in the same period, it's not in the same language, it's not the same people or history. It doesn't fit history, culture, or language. Now, it's a really interesting source of information because all of our Greek speakers know the Septuagint, which we'll get into, right? We'll explain that. We'll look at all these documents. But the point is, all of our Greek speakers and writers at that time know Isaiah. So maybe they threw some really cool Isaiah stuff into John, and we can look back at it and kind of get some information from it. But what documents will we use to compare with John? Matthew, Mark, all the New Testament documents. Yes, sir. Good.
Question, so maybe I'm not understanding proof text necessarily, but if Isaiah went through and in the prophecy said these things are going to happen, and then and some of them are rather strange when you hear the prophecy, but then if you can go historically and say, well, we can prove that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in a stable, and all these other things, why isn't that kind of a proof text?
It can be a proof text, but it doesn't help us much. Well, you have to have a function of belief, and believe what?
But if there's a proof that Isaiah was written, we go back and we prove the historical veracity of Isaiah, and that he really existed and said these things, that it wasn't someone writing them after the fact, after
Right.
Jesus, and he wrote down this prophecy, and whoop, see, it happened.
I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying you have. Okay, anybody familiar with what's that guy? The prophecies of Nostradamus. Okay, how many of those prophecies have occurred?
All of them who you choose to believe that.
It depends on who you talk to. How about Revelation? You know, Revelation is really hard to understand, right? Because it's a Greek document. And I'm not belittling or saying that you can't look at prophetic kind of things, but the problem becomes a question of belief. And we'd rather, you know, if you can say cut and dried, like for example, okay, I'll give you an example right from the document. It says, I believe it's in Isaiah, it says, this is in the King James, and a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And we find that one in Matthew, right? The words are, and a Beulah shall conceive and bear a son. Now, Beulah in Hebrew means a young woman. However, there is no word for virgin in Hebrew. There is a word for virgin in Greek, Parthenon. Parthenon is a word for virgin in Greek. So guess what? When you translate in the Septuagint, what did you write? And a virgin shall conceive. A Parthenon shall conceive and bear a son. In Hebrew, it says Beulah. Now, the problem with Beulah is one of those words that substitute word. It's a word that's used for a person, a woman not married. morally, ethically, can a woman not married bear a son? No, they're considered a virgin. So the problem you have with that word, now see, we would have to dig really deep into it, but that's a beautiful prophecy. And a virgin shall conceive. In the Septuagint it says, and a Parthon, a virgin shall conceive. In Hebrew it says, and a Beulah shall conceive. And your opponents are going to say, well, yeah, there's young women all over the place that have conceived and have children, and they're not married. Ba-da-bum, right? And that's the problem. So, God having Isaiah write that, I believe, specifically meant, because, and that's what we'll get into, right? Culture, history. If you have no word for it, can you say it? Right? If I have no word for a virgin, I have no word for a virgin. So what do I do? What happens when I get a missive from God? And God says, write this down for me. And what do? I pick from the words I have available, and I put in the best selection word. See what I'm saying? So I don't disagree with you, but it becomes really difficult to compare documents across antiquity, across times. Now, should we do that? Yeah, we will, because that's cool. That's stuff that is really good information. And we as Christians, okay, want that information. That's the stuff that you pass to your kids. That's the really cool things historically that, that build our knowledge, right? But are you going to win people? This isn't a class on how to save, on how to bring people to Christ. Although everything we do is about bringing people to Christ. That's the whole point of, right? And that's the whole point of church and everything else. If I can equip you with knowledge about the Greek and give you a intellectual information so that you can then pass that on to children, people, others, right? Then we have succeeded. And you think this won't happen, I guarantee it'll happen sometime in your life. If it hasn't happened already, you'll have in your back pocket some piece of information you got from this class or another class, and somebody will say something, and you go, hey, I know about that, right? And they'll go, wow, that's pretty neat. I never heard that before. I know. Anyway, so I don't disagree, but the point is that we would like to, and we'll do this. When we look at when we look at veracity of the text, we'll look at, these are kind of not the bounds, although we bound what we do, right? But then we'll say, okay, then how do we bring in these other parts? And I will. Matter of fact, the ones we want to bring in, apocryphal allusions and references. We did that before with Hebrews, if you remember. We want to bring in the Old Testament references. Why? Well, those who were in the class, you're in the Torah class, you had, too much time to think about the Torah. All of this in John, let me give you okay. Usually they talk about the Gospel of John. What do they say about the Gospel of John?
It's the easiest one to read.
Easiest one to read.
That's what they tell people to start with when they get on the Bible.
Anybody read Gospel of John recently? What is funny about the Gospel of John? And you're right, it is. It's one of the easiest to read. It's one of the most, but there's something really funny about John. And as a matter of fact, you'll hear it all the time. They'll say, John is the least Jewish of the Gospels. But has anyone read it recently? I would say that John, I did not give you, there is a very famous historical outline from, I love this when this stuff fits together like this. What is that? The Vision of John from the Jerusalem Bible, one of the earliest Bibles divisions where they've done an outline, and guess what it's based on? The Jewish feasts. So the Gospel of John, more than all of the other Gospels, what are called the Synoptic Gospels. I disagree. I do not believe there are Synoptic Gospels. Anyone know what that means?
Supposed to tell a story.
Well, the Synoptic Gospels are the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are supposed to be in similar historical order, but they're not. Somewhat chronological. We would say, and don't use the word story, we would say the history, that the scenes, the circumstances are, you can parallel them. And some Bibles even have parallel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can see, in Matthew and Luke, right, you have the birth, right? Mark kind of screws up. Then you have the baptism, and then you have similar scenes or events occurring that you can kind of match. There's in Matthew you have the Sermon on the Mount, but in Luke you have the Sermon on the Plain. Okay, and you try to line them up. Yes, sir.
I heard this morning, just coincidentally on the way in, this very thing they was saying in the Greek that the synoptic was like, the Greek word was science. Well, it was with, and then optic is perspective, if you will, so optic with. So it was explained that it's like if you, just like we would do anything in this legal historical, if you have an accident and you have one person that's over here on the sidewalk and another person that was viewing it from a car, construction worker sees it this way, you're using those different perspectives to see the same scene, but they all come from a different, unique viewing.
Yeah. Now, the idea of the Synoptic Gospels came from the Tübingen School. And part of the reason, I'm going to start early because we'll start with some ideas. But the early ideas is this. I have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, Matthew is a disciple. Mark was a disciple of a disciple. Luke was a historian who was a disciple of a disciple, basically of Paul. And John was a disciple. So we think that Mark, this may have been an eyewitness. So an eyewitness. He was not eyewitness, he was a secondary source and eyewitness. So theoretically, if in just writing, I have 4 different sources. And actually, there are 12 known extant gospels. We'll have to look back in my notes. I don't think I have it in these notes. I believe there are 12 extant gospels. There are 54 known gospels. There are 12 extant gospels, and there are 4 that are considered verifiable gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the presumption is they are all separate sources that were written. What Tübingen School did, and this is the entire fault of Tübingen School, is they said, these all seem to be similar. So we know that there's a Gnostic gospel called, what's it called? Gospel of Judas. There are 2 types of writings before the Gospels, before the New Testament writings. There are sayings and there is narrative. In ancient literature, you do not find them mixed together until the Gospels. C.S. Lewis, here states C.S. Lewis writings, he'll talk about this as one of his big things in his class. So I give you a freebie from his class. He taught English, and basically the Gospels invented what we call modern literature. Modern literature includes sayings and gospel. We'll explain more of that when we get to the veracity part. But you basically see there are a couple of Gnostic sayings gospels. And one of them is really old. don't know if I have it with me, but it's, I think it's Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel that is all the sayings of Christ without narrative, any narrative. It's a Gnostic gospel. And so what happened is the Tübingen School guys said, hey, we noticed that this Greek, the words aren't the same in Greek even. But we noticed that the events and the progression and the history is kind of similar. So there must have been a sayings gospel before this. Maybe a sayings and a narrative. Or maybe they just made up the narrative. Doesn't matter. There was a sayings gospel before this.
Is that what they call Q?
And that's called Q. Quella. Yes. This is, okay, there is no scholarship behind this at all. This is totally made up. Tübingen School made this up. Okay? How do we know that Tübingen School made this up?
We haven't
Never
found
been
you.
found?
There has never been a sayings gospel found that matches what Quella would do. As a matter of fact, I have a copy of what Quella is supposed to look like. They've actually produced one. It's the imagination of foolish people, okay? You don't make up stuff. The other problem we have is this, and I'm drawing ahead, I guess, that's all right. The other problem we have is this. There is a presumption. There's a presumption of what language that Jesus and the disciples used. Anyone want to guess?
Aramaic?
There's a presumption that Aramaic was the language of Christ. This is impossible. And I will point out to you how this is impossible. The language that Jesus Christ had to have used is
Greek.
why?
The world is great.
Everybody talked it.
Not just because the world is Greek, it's because every time Jesus uses Aramaic, what do?
Quoted.
They quote him in Aramaic. It would be insane. Okay, if I have a sayings gospel in Aramaic, it would be insane to translate some of the Aramaic into Greek and some of it not. What do you choose, right? That's crazy talk. It has to be in Greek. All of these have to have been written in Greek. There's also something we will study, and I will make sure you understand it as well as you can. I know it's hard, and that's the Logos to Telos. Logos to Telos, okay? You find Logos to Telos in all these documents. One of the reasons they mess up the idea of the synoptic gospel is because we in English write intro, body, conclusion. Hebrew writes synopsis, body. Greeks always write Logos to Telos. So if you try to interpret Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in terms of an intro, body, conclusion, what do you end up with? Synoptic gospel, right? And it's like, no, they're not. They are individual Logos to Telos. And those of you, maybe, 15 years ago, I taught a class on the Gospels, which I will bring in some of that information. But I taught an extensive class on the Gospels, Logos to Telos, for each of the Gospels, to show how they are different. They do have an interesting similar conclusion, which is Jesus Christ is God, right? And that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. It's really cool stuff. But all of them are different Logos to Telos, and you can see it. We will be looking at John, which, as I mentioned, is more of a Jewish document. Yes, sir. You have a question?
And they're written to different audiences, each of them, right? The way the argument is changed to point at a specific audience.
I would say that is not a bad... they were all written for a Greek audience, and the Greek writer wanted to bring out... Though Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each wanted to bring out a different point. Luke was interested in the history. He wanted the history. He wanted to be just like, what's his name? What's that? Well, before Josephus, because Josephus was past this period, but just like, what's his name? The one who wrote, you had Theodocles and you had the other one, Herodotus. He wanted to be like Herodotus, right? Everybody wants to be like Herodotus, right? It's history, even though Herodotus may have made up a little bit or not seen some of the stuff. It's okay. It's a huge question today, but that's what veracity's about, right? Well, we know that Luke went and interviewed. It appears like he interviewed Mary. And he says in the beginning, I interviewed these people. So he went and looked for primary source eyewitnesses to write his book. And his book was about history. He was writing to history. He's writing a Logos to Telos style about history. And you look at Matthew. It gets a little bit more in depth, but Matthew was writing about basically people coming to know Christ. This is a very simplistic, high level kind of thing. But remember, what was it about Matthew? Matthew was the tax collector. And Jesus Christ called a tax collector who was a Jewish guy, right? I mean, you're talking about, this is like calling Zacchaeus, the lowest of the low, right? And so Matthew's whole point is, look, who did Jesus, in Matthew, I love the Matthew accounts have some beautiful stuff in it. The woman who had a flow of blood, right? That touched Jesus. That is like anathema. That's Matthew, right? And the little girl who died, and Jesus said, Tabitha, come, and touched her. You don't touch dead people, right? Where's the Good Samaritan? Is that in Matthew, I think? The account of the Good Samaritan? Or is it Luke? Anyway, the Good Samaritan is a very similar kind of thing, because a person willing, a Samaritan, in John, the Samaritan woman, right?
At the well?
At the well. She drew water for him. He drank water from the Samaritan person. Matthew would be like clapping. I love it, right? What about Mark? Mark is kind of interesting because Mark is I think Mark's the earliest of the Gospels. It could be maybe the earliest gospel. We studied Mark pretty extensively, although I think I want to do a more extensive survey study of John. But in Mark, we saw that Mark was probably thrown together because Christ had died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. They all heard that, right? And what was the next question that the Greek and the Hebrew and everybody asked? Well, what happened before that? Right? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ... Yeah, but what about everything else? And so Mark was like, well, okay, let me jot down what I saw and what Peter told me and what I heard from the other disciples, right? Barnabas, and Paul, and the other guys. And so I think Mark was he was the guy who was trying to write down a synopsis of the sayings and the narrative. And he did it Mark did it. I think Mark's the guy who invented this new literature. Mark did it. And I don't know, I'd like to talk to C.S. Lewis, sorry he's dead. But if we had C.S. right here, we could ask him that question. What do you think? Because this is a beautiful question. Who invented this? I think Mark did. Mark, what is the importance about sayings and narrative? Why would I write down sayings in Isaiah, for example? Because they came from the original source, God. Does it matter what you say? No, but what matters is remember in Isaiah said, and I was praying and and God came to me and said. And then he wrote down what he said. That's the sayings part, right? And then in perspective, you might have some separate narration of events, but very rarely in the old world, you would have sayings and narrative. You wrote down sayings because you wrote down the important words of a god or God, kledon in Greek. The narrative is the stuff that's happening. Like in the Torah, for example, right? We see the mixture of sayings. Well, we kind of see a very interesting mixture. The Torah is almost entirely sayings from God. And God told them, right? And then they wrote it down. And then in other cases we have, and they did this and they did that. Those are the narratives. But in Mark, for the first time in literature, we have the sayings of Jesus and the sayings of other people interwoven with narrative. The modern literature. It's modern literature. And the reason is because Jesus is God. Or actually, that is the proof text that the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the Logos to tell us, they want you to know that Jesus is God. And so if Jesus is God, then his sayings are really important. And within the context, the people said, well, how did this, okay, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. Yeah, but what happened? How did you get there, right? And everybody wanted to know. And so Mark wrote that down. He wrote the narration, and within it he wrote what he had heard Jesus say. So it did not come, there is no Quella. It is not Aramaic. It did not come from a sayings gospel. These are all three specific individual gospels. Yes, sir.
In the case of Matthew, where he starts with the whole lineage, both from the mother's side and the father's side, showing that he was in the lineage of David.
Right.
Wasn't it? It was written specifically for the Jews, because they would only appreciate that.
Yes.
So that's, I guess.
Well, we think that Luke's was written from the standpoint of Mary, from the woman's genealogy. Yes, sir.
Well, this is kind of a side point to his, but were there other texts from the New Testament time period in Aramaic, just to, if there's any credence to their theory that there was an Aramaic sayings gospel?
No, there are none that we know of. There may be, we may find some eventually, but the thing is that nobody wrote in Aramaic. No one wrote in Aramaic. People spoke in Aramaic. I hate to tell you this, but at that time, Hebrew was a dead language. People wrote it. People read it. But it was not an active language that people used. They used Aramaic. And by the way, there was no reason to write Aramaic, because I either wrote Hebrew or I wrote Greek. And the whole world wrote Greek. So the Aramaic sources, you know, there is some written Aramaic. You'll find some Aramaic writing in the Hebrew text, for example, Daniel and I think it's Ezra, Nehemiah. There is some Aramaic writing. It's really hard to tell, and it gets complicated. If you remember this, history is not a bumper sticker. That's why, I know, you see it every now and then, right? People throw out these bumper sticker things, right, that are about historical stuff. It's like, dude, you're off the base. Historical things are not something that you should approach, in my opinion, callously. I want to mention this because I thought this was so interesting. I don't talk about this usually in elections, so I thought it was really cool. The pastor talked today about getting lost. He talked about Daniel Boone, right? Let me ask you a question. Did Daniel Boone ever know where he was?
He was going someplace for the first time. He's blazing trails.
Yeah. Today I can pull out today I can pull out my phone and GPS and I know where I am. There's amazing things I
You can get the
can...
coordinates, latitude and longitude right there.
And the MGRS coordinates that I
Right.
need to send the Army to get an airstrike. Yes, I can do amazing things. But before the phone, before GPS, I lived that era. I flew with charts. How did I know where I was? Because I could identify anybody. I've never been lost. I've been temporally displaced, but never lost. So, I may not know what time it is and where exactly I am in the world, but I'm not lost. Well, you have a map, a chart. I have flown and driven. You ever driven with a map and you ever got lost from the map? Right. You don't know where you are. You have no way of knowing where you are, right? We have moved from a world where everyone, to a degree, was always lost, to a world where everyone pretty much knows where they are all the time.
You can share your location, you can track people, you can do whatever.
The world has radically changed. You know, the perception of a person, you know, well, even today, we see it all the time. You know, years ago, no one would have died in the wilderness unless they got mauled by a bear or shot by somebody, right? Why? Because everybody knew how to build a fire, everybody knew about getting lost, everybody knew about shelter. Today, there are people, fully cogent people with everything they need who go out and die in the wilderness because they're unprepared, woefully incapable, and ignorant. That's it.
How can you be lost if you don't know where you are?
That's right.
But I'm just saying, it's just, to me, it's amazing. And I think I need to add this because I got this on the list of things, right, in culture. So,
Are you saying that Daniel Boone didn't know where he was then, or are you saying he knew where he was?
he had no idea where he was. He was wandering. Look, if you go through the wilderness, I guarantee you, go ahead, try it. Go to some.
I know, you get lost real fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to anywhere where there's no, even if you have a chart, unless you know how to use it and you have a compass, I can take a compass and I can find you. I know, I've been trained. I'm fully, quadruply, multiply trained in using a compass, and I could probably even use a sextant. But guess what? Sextants didn't exist until basically, real sextants didn't exist until really the beginning of the 2 centuries ago. You know, sextants even. And sextants, you know, whenever he got outside of sight of of some landmark, of a city or a road, you know, read John Fenimore Cooper, just saying. But the world, before GPS, I was flying across the North Atlantic, okay, and you only can know latitude with a sextant. You can't know longitude. To get longitude, you have to do timing, and you have to use a timing sextant to figure other stuff. But there are all kinds of different methods you use for determining where you are, from using altitude or pressure. Use pressure. Use, if you can see, if you have a map, a radar, and you can map stuff, you can find stuff. I mean, you can do that. But you know how many people? I never did it, but you know how many people have coasted in, what they call coasting. When you coast in to Europe, if you're more than 20 miles off, guess what? Violated. The French will violate you. The Brits sometimes will give you a little thing. But today, people are within a mile, right? But in the old days, if you were within 20 miles, it was considered okay, right? And you're using dead reckoning. Anybody know what dead reckoning is? That's you just
Lewis and Clark used it.
everybody used it.
Yeah, they were very accurate. The miles that they went, it's just amazing.
Well, they didn't have wind to contend with when they were walking.
Well, I don't know how they did reckoning, but they kind of used, but they came pretty close to the actual miles.
One of the earliest things that was invented, there are a lot of really cool stuff that got invented back in the day, and I have one, pedometer. Pedometer, yeah. I had one when I was a kid. They're not that difficult to make, but you set them to your stride, and a good Boy Scout. Now today you just get your GPS out, like, oh, I know where I am, right? But back in the day when you were hiking, and when I was a scout kind of guy, I was hiking all the time, and you go hiking, and how far did I hike? Well, it matters because of dead reckoning, right? Now, if you know where you are, you may not get too lost, but if you're just going, like, anybody anybody ever tried to use a compass and actually go places? They made me do it because when I was in field training, in survival training, I had to do it, and I had to use a compass to, figure the mountains, triangulate where you were, because they put you out in the middle of it, and they didn't tell you where you were. They're like, here you go. Now you have to escape. Here's your compass. You're going south. Make sure the enemy guys don't get you. And they have, enemy guys with helicopters and dogs and people roaming around the woods trying to catch you. It's like, this is kind of fun.
Is
Anyway,
that a precursor to an escape room?
hey, it's just pure training, man.
Yeah, much larger.
The military training, and I'm saying if you haven't done it, but today I don't know what they do. They take away your phones. They give you a chart. I don't know. In any case, the whole point of this is we want to look at history, and already, if you didn't notice what I'm doing, I'm intentionally doing it to you. I know you probably heard some of this before, but I found a new thing, getting lost. Because what I want you to do is I want you to shed all that history for 2,000 years and imagine that, you're a Greek guy or gal, standing there in your pelican, and, you're not wearing, with a tunic. You don't have a toga. You're not Roman. You're Greek. And you got your pelican and your emation, and you are basically probably starving. You wish you had your meat. You haven't, I want to picture this to you, and I want you to see the world in that fashion, and I want you to understand it in the fashion that John. So when we go digging into John, we will see this stuff come alive. And like I said, if we think, and we can do a little bit more, get a little more time, but if you think the big deal here, where's my little thing? The Jerusalem Bible, as I said, sets up that John, basically based on the Jewish feasts. So according to their outline, you have the first Passover, the Shabbat of the paralytic, the Passover of the bread of life. You have the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Passion, the Resurrection during the Passover week. According to the Jerusalem Bible, John is all about the feasts. So if you wondered why I thought that this would be a perfect analogy from the Torah, because we just spent a whole lot of time looking at Torah, sacrifice, and feasts, and that was the last thing we did, right? The feast and the feast cycle. We even have a chart, right? Jesus help us make a chart. We have a cool chart that we can look at. Maybe I'll bring that back. But the big deal for this is to see John in the context of the time. Now, I'll give you a freebie on that too. So we looked at the Torah, but this is 2,000 to 1,500 years after the writing of the Torah. So already we know there are going to be, and we talked about them. If you remember in class, I told you, this is how the Jewish people view these feasts today. This is how they view things today. We will see that transition, and we should see it in John. And I'll give you another precursor. John is the most messianic of all the Gospels. If you look at my little thing here, just looking at the book of signs, the book of glory, the book of signs. These are Simeon. We will look in detail about signs, because the whole point of the Greek in John. Okay, what's the first thing that somebody who's a non-believer asks? Prove it to me, right? Well, it wasn't as hard today as it was then. Because when they said, prove it to me, what did Jesus do? Made 600 bottles of wine. I mean, for goodness sakes, you can't miss this one, right? There's a lot of things that Jesus did in the context of his Jewish culture and the times. And the things he did are these signs, these semeion. And by the way, the word is not used in the other Gospels. It's used almost exclusively in John. In the other ones they use a miracle, and I can't remember what the Greek word is for that. But semeion is the word for sign. And we will get into detail about what the signs mean. So, just an overview. The big deal in this class is to look at the culture, history, and language in John. We are going to prove John next week. Well, maybe I guess I'll prove John next week. And then we can always look at these culture and the history within the context of what we're looking at. But like I said, and you guys have been in my classes before, so you understand this. But part of this will be, as I've said before, looking back at how things were done in the past, so that we can then compare them. And just like we've had, extensive discussions about years and dates and months, and how do you figure these things, right? I hope that we will have the same degree of confusion. No, not confusion. Of clarity because we know, but lack of clarity because we say, how could we not know these things, right? I mean, just trying to figure out what a year is. And yet, we look at our calendar and we just had the first of the year. How do you know? Did you guys go out and figure that out yourself? No.
Fireworks started, that's what I knew.
The fireworks started, I knew it was happening, right?
Yeah.
And every time I look at my stupid watch and I see the moon, I'm like, well, my goodness, I could almost be an astronomer back in the old days, right? Anyway, thank you, God, for your word. We thank you for the gospel of John. I pray you look after us this week and take care of us. In your name we pray, amen.